Hey, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. Delighted to have with me today Chris Minnich, Executive Director of the Council of Chief State School Officers. Chris, CCSSO is one of the organizations responsible for birthing the Common Core, really you guys in the National Governors Association. As you look back, it's been a decade now. What are the things that reformers really got right in devising and in launching the Common Core?
You know, I think there's a long list of things, but the things that come to my mind are the idea that the public wants high standards for every kid. Like that actually resonated across the country. And if we simply were talking about English and math standards in the debate, we would have been fine. And there would have been no controversy around it. We would have just been able to go forward and make this part of what's going on in American education across the country. I also think the idea of being state-based was the right play. Every state has a different context, so the idea that every state would ever adopt the exact same standards is actually not possible. There are things in state context, Montana, for example, wants more on American Indian education in their ELA standards. And we acknowledged that up front, but it got lost in the debate because it became, you either adopt the Common Core or not. The idea was always to have higher standards across the country. And we were successful on that part of it. But the name itself, Common Core, got tied up in a lot of the other discussion that's going on across the country around federalism and who has the right to make these decisions about standards.
When you say if we had been talking about reading and math standards, the Common Core advocates would have been okay, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, we were talking about a lot of different things. We were talking about whether the federal government had any right in terms of incentivizing standards adoption in the states, whether or not there were things in these standards like whether or not it would be like taking away freedom or privacy of individual students. Like those are really important issues, but they didn't have anything to do with academic standards. And so we ended up talking about a lot of different things, including teacher evaluation. This is one of the things that the federal government put on the table in midway through this process. And teacher evaluation got totally tied up in the standards debate. How we evaluate our teachers is totally separate from what we expect of our students. However, it was one conversation and it got tied up that way.
People sometimes talk about the incentives the Obama administration used to promote the Common Core. We hear about Race to the Top. We hear about waivers from No Child Left Behind. Can you explain to folks what when they hear incentives, what actually happened over those years?
Yeah. So in the Race to the Top program, the administration had a pot of money from the Recovery Act after the Obama administration took over, where they were able to offer that to states, but they put some requirements on it that states would need to do things like teacher evaluation. They would need to implement data systems that collected data on how students were doing in terms of performance. And one big thing in that was to adopt higher standards. And one of the ways they could prove that they had adopted higher standards was to adopt a set of standards that are common among the states. The only set of standards that were common among the states was, at that point, were the Common Core standards. So therefore, they didn't explicitly say you had to adopt the Common Core, but it was one way that you could justify that requirement in Race to the Top. Under waivers, they did the same thing. So they said you have to have higher standards, and the way you could prove that is either to have the Common Core or have a letter from your higher ed community saying those standards were at high levels. And so states did take both of those things. So there was no...
Was it like half and half the states?
Yeah, well, so it wasn't, that most of the states just checked that box with the Common Core. But there were other options, but there definitely were incentives that pushed people towards these standards from the federal government.
That's great. So federal involvement, privacy, teacher evaluation. How did they become part of the Common Core conversation? How did that happen?
Yeah, it wasn't magic. Obviously, the previous administration took a liking to what the standards were and what they were about, and did a lot to incentivize states to adopt these standards, whether it be via Race to the Top or later the waivers from No Child Left Behind. So they inserted themselves into that conversation. I would also say once they inserted themselves, it gave space for people to spread misinformation. So I think it was both of these things that happened happen at the same time, was that the federal government did do some incentivizing, and then the people that were opposed to that incentivizing went further in terms of their rhetoric. And then we got into a position where we couldn't tell what the truth was or what it wasn't. And that was a really hard spot to be.
So can you concretize that for especially say if I'm a 25-year-old reformer today, some of these debates played out 6-7 years ago. I might have been a senior in high school.
Right.
So when you say the rhetoric got exaggerated, is there an example or two that comes to mind looking backwards?
Yeah, I mean, there's some real extreme ones. So like the retina scan stuff came up in a couple states where they were worried that Common Core required like students to have scans of their eyes and things. I mean, so there's some extreme stuff that happened, and none of that was obviously true. But the part that I think we should learn from is that even if you have a good idea, you can't just assume people across this country will be like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, let's just implement it. We actually have to have conversations about this. We are in a democracy. We need to be involved with people in the local level. They can't just set standards from Washington or anywhere else and expect every state to be like, oh yeah, this seems like a great idea. So if we actually had engaged in those discussions more thoroughly, I think we could have pushed back on some of that misinformation, but because we were in a place of defense, because of a lot of the things that were happening in the federal side, we didn't do enough of that.
So summarizing, a couple of the key things that the advocates got right would be, how would you put that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea that high standards across the country resonates, I think it does. And you also look at, even with the Common Core being pushed back on in states, you notice that they set standards that are very similar to the Common Core or have things in them that are like the Common Core. So I think we actually got the content right. I still have yet to see stuff that challenges my assumptions on what we have in the actual standards. So I think the idea behind it was right. I think our implementation side, we totally underestimated the ability of states and districts to help their teachers get ready to teach these standards. We needed a full court press on that. And instead we were talking about whether the federal government wrote the standards or whether teacher evaluation was a good idea. And we should have been talking about how do we get every kid to these standards.
So that brings me kind of the next question. Sounds like you're anticipating. So what did reformers not get right? Sounds like part of it may have been something to do with teachers, but what did reformers get wrong looking backwards when it came to pushing the Common Core?
I think there was a big assumption made that we were right. And what I mean by we, the folks that were excited about the Common Core, that we were right and everybody would just get on board. And I think we didn't spend enough time in those conversations about why we were doing this. In reality, this should be a conservative idea, that states set high standards for their kids. Like that should have been the Republicans in these state legislatures saying, yes, this is right for our kids in Kentucky. Yes, this is right for our kids in Tennessee. And we didn't have those initial conversations. We did it from the governor and chief level, but we didn't get into the state legislators enough because, and also the turnover was just a hard part of this with the amount of turnover you see in elected positions. So I think we didn't get it right in terms of the number and the amount of conversations we had on that side. I also just don't think we were ready once the standards came out to have a serious conversation about training teachers and helping them understand the standards. And some states did it better than others. You look at California, they didn't do the teacher evaluation thing and instead decided to work on implementation. They aren't seeing that kind of pushback on the Common Core. Now, granted, the politics are different in California, but I still think it's a good example of a place where they've really dedicated themselves to helping teachers.
So, in generally speaking, why didn't we see that kind of outreach to legislators? Why didn't we see the work with teachers that you said was so critical?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think the national funding community was very focused on the political side of this and trying to get this thing implemented at the legislative level. And there wasn't as much of a conversation about helping teachers with curriculum and instruction resources. Now that is not universal. I want to be very clear. Like there were states that did a great job on it. But I think if we had done more on that side, we wouldn't have seen the pushback that we did get. Because the teachers would have been there saying, actually this is working for me. And we had a lot of teachers do that. If you go to Tennessee, I've visited around Tennessee, they have teachers that'll tell you, just leave my standards alone, we got this. And that's what we needed across the country. We don't have that. But I will say, the big point that I want to make sure I get across here is, despite all the controversy, we still have 40 or 45 states with better standards than we started with. So yes, there were some things we could have done better, but in the end, states made a decision to keep those high standards even when they were, pull back the name. And so I think that's real success here.
So, when you point out that 40 odd states have some version of the Common Core, seems like senior officials in the Obama Department of Education would say, aha, would have only been a dozen states or 24 states in 2009, but we put it in a race at the top. Yeah. We urged states to do this through our No Child Left Behind waivers. Yep. We took a lot of grief, but that was the right thing because we pushed the reform forward. Are they right if they think about things that way?
I think it just depends on your view of sort of how we're divided as a government, honestly. And I mean, from my perspective, I think they went a bit far, and we told them so. They shouldn't have put the specific set of standards, or the only way you could satisfy that requirement is by adopting Common Core in those two initiatives. So I just think they had a real chance to incentivize without sort of mandating, and they went a little too far on some of that, in my opinion. I think you would have started with fewer states. I think that's what would have happened. You wouldn't have had 45 involved. You wouldn't have had 40 adopt quickly. You would have had 20 or 25 say this is a good thing, and it would have grown across the country. It may have taken them 6-7 years to get across the country. I think I'd argue that would have been a better process.
I was going to say, because the flip side would be the argument from critics is, wait a minute, maybe you're in 40 states, but it's hugely controversial.
Yeah.
A lot of, over half those states aren't using the Common Core, the new Common Core tests. Yeah. That there's real questions about how parents are receiving this. That a more deliberate strategy, that even if the Obama administration helped get Common Core adopted, that there's a whole bunch of negatives attached to that that could have been avoided.
I think that's true, but I would also add that a lot of this would have happened anyway if it was an Obama administration initiative. So we do have some of that would have happened no matter what they did. But I think they would even look back on their strategy and say, hey, maybe if it had been optional, if it really had truly been optional in a lot of those settings, then we would have an ability to show, hey, this was optional if you wanted a waiver. We can't do that right now, and so it makes it harder to have those conversations.
So as you look back over the decade of the Common Core and Council of Chief State School Officers' role in supporting it and helping states with it, are there a couple of takeaways that you take from the whole Common Core experience that folks should be aware of that help you kind of as you look forward?
Well, I mean, the first thing that is really true is that the state chiefs as a whole really do want to lead for better outcomes for kids. And that when you talk, it becomes less political when you actually talk about what's going on in classrooms and districts across the country. So if we can take it to a local level, we actually have a better conversation than if we start at the national level and then come down. So we need to let ideas emerge from the states and districts, I would say, because they were really smart in ESSA to allow for the flexibility around testing. I'm really interested to see if states actually do take them up on this pilot on what other tests could look like, because I think we just have a programmed mindset around standards and assessment, and this is the only way we can do it. So I'm actually hopeful that if we can start with the states or the districts in some places, we will come up with better ideas for the country. Second thing, and then I'm happy for follow-up on any of that, but the second thing is that our governance system as a country, it's going to continue to be debated no matter, you see it in the current nomination fight, you see it in a lot of the things we have about education across the country. You have groups in DC that say the federal government needs a bigger role in education to make sure the states do what they need to do. So that's never going to go away. And I think we just got to be honest about that and say, as states, it's our job to step up so that debate becomes mute.
Well, you made this interesting point that you said when you talk about these things with state chiefs, you talk about them in the state, that they're less political when they're getting talked about in Washington.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a whole institution of education in this town that is designed to fight with each other. So, we have people that come to work every day to protect kids that states have traditionally ignored. And I love that they're here doing that. I think that's important for us. We need that push. But when states do the right thing, we also need to say, hey, they're doing the right thing. You can't always have states be the bad guys, right? And so this is actually an interesting discussion. I'm really glad we're having it, because it puts into context what I've been wrestling with is how do we have an honest discussion about what's actually going on in education, not what we think is going on. Because states are creating these ESSA plans, they're building accountability systems. How would we know things are better in this country? And I would argue it's if we have more kids going on to college, we have more kids going on into job placement programs, more career opportunities for kids coming out of high school. So if I was a state chief right now, I would be looking at those metrics coming out of my high schools. Are those moving? Because we need kids to be ready to go. And all the other noise, we need more kids and more kids of color doing better on those metrics.
So as we think about, Common Core, you guys in the NGA really got started on this 2007, I guess, right?
Yeah,
so 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
This created enormous disruption in the school reform world. People who used to work together became opponents. Lots of opposition stirred up, the opt-out movement in New York. Is the lesson here, was Common Core worth it? Was it a good reform? Was it, how, as you think about the lessons one draws from the Common Core, how do you make sense of that?
It's a really good question. I like to tell the story about, I was the one that was asked to lead the development of the actual standards. And I remember my boss at the time coming in and saying to me, hey, we think we're going to have like 8 to 10 states that want to write standards together. Do you want to go write these and work with the states and get teachers involved and things like that? I said, sure, let's go do it. And, at that point, we thought we were really just going to have a small number of states work together and set those standards, and then we were going to go to a bigger audience. When we had 48 states sign up to develop the standards, then we knew it was going to be like, okay, this is a big thing for the country. So, was it worth it? I think it absolutely was worth it because it ties back to my original point about how many states actually have standards now that would put kids on a pathway to doing well after they leave high school. So I think no doubt is it worth it. Now the question for me is, could we have done it better so we didn't have to live this 10 years or what's going to come next, which is continued pushback against those standards. And I think we could have done, we talked about some of the things we could have done better, but the biggest thing for me is if it comes from locals, we create that buy-in earlier on, we could have had a different discussion in the states because honestly, this should have been an issue that conservatives owned, that state standards at a high level, that's easy. We should be able to do that in this country.
And what happened? Where did the conservatives kind of jump off the train?
Well, you know the answer to this. You see the federal government intervention was really, then it became a discussion about who's controlling this situation. And it was always 2 state-based organizations. We were the ones, I never asked the federal government what they thought should be in these standards. But the perception and the actual incentivizing that the federal government did became big problems for us politically. That's when it changed.
So when you think about the kind of advice you give young reformers today, how to make changes, how to make big changes and make a difference for kids, but to do them in a way where you feel like this is working the way we want it to work. What kind of advice do you offer? What are 2 or 3?
Well, big ones in your book. You have to come at this with a little humility. If you don't, and if you think you know the answer to every question, you're just going to end up speaking to people that agree with you. And I have seen in this town and across the country that when you are certain of something, especially in the education space, you tend not to look at other evidence. You tend not to say, wait a second, do we need to have a conversation about what this person's saying to me? And granted, some of the stuff we didn't need to have a conversation about. I used the retina scan earlier. So, that stuff we didn't need to have a conversation about. But the real concerns about how this was going to roll out in states, we needed to have a conversation about. So tying to your book, if you approach it with a little humility, if you approach it with a conversation, if you talk to people you disagree with and actually listen to what they're saying, you're going to become a smarter education reformer. And you're going to become somebody that people want to be around, even if they disagree with you, because then you can have conversations and actually talk about the issues and try to get to better solutions. So I was really glad to see that in your book.
I appreciate it. Any other hard-earned tips here?
It's interesting. In talking to state chiefs, you have these moments where you have a new state chief come in and they're relatively new on the job and they don't know what we've been through in the last 10 years. I think you can just assume that people don't understand why we stepped into either the standards or the assessments or the accountability conversation as a country. That we're having a moment right now where everything is going to be pushed back to the states. And it's going to be really important for states to be those kind of conversation places where, we're not going to get specific action from Washington. And I would argue that's a good thing for the states. But that does mean the states have a bigger responsibility here, that they've got to lead some of these conversations. They've got to not let schools have kids in it, or have schools where kids are going every day that aren't going to get done for those kids. So the action is at the state level for the short term, and we've got to lean in on that. And that's our organization, but it's also some of the organizations here in this town.
So last word. So if somebody takes that advice and they say, you know what, I want to get started, I'm going to go try to help out in a state, try to make a difference.
Yeah.
Where should they get started? What kind of job can they make a difference in?
Yeah.
What should they do?
So I would argue some of the organizations in town have very good state-based chapters. So I would look there. You can come work for CCSSO too, because I think we need good people. But thinking about some of the civil rights organizations actually working in state capitals more directly, some of those I think are really good developments. I would also say we need people to be truth tellers in states. And what I mean by that is not necessarily hold people accountable, but we need better information on how kids are doing. We're transitioning new accountability systems. We've been programming the entire country off of English and math test scores for a long time now. Mm-hmm. And I hope that's going to change. I hope we have better measures. I hope we have outcome measures into college and into job placements. So those are the types of things I would be working on. I think that will really affect the dialogue.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.